Welcome to History with Dr. Brovkin. My dear subscribers, usually I begin my videos with Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin, but today is somewhat special. Today I continue with another segment of a long interview which Karissa Tauber asked me to do, in which I reminisce about my life, and I have already posted two of the first segments of this long interview of 2.5 hours. And the first one is called Born in the USSR, where I remember my youth and my student years in the Soviet Union of the 1950s and 60s and early 70s. The second video is called From Soviet Dissident to a Harvard Professor, where I discuss my arrival in the United States in 1975, and then the 1970s and 80s, and partly 1990s, when I served as an associate professor of Soviet history at Harvard. Now, this is the third part, and I continue my conversation with Karissa Tauber, but today the focus, as it happened, is on the Russia in the 1990s. As it so happened, you will hear it, I went to Russia as an associate professor in a sabbatical year to do research for my new book. And this is the reminiscences and impressions of life in Russia in the 1990s. I also want to tell you that at the in this description, I will put a link to 3 videos that I made earlier on life in the 1990s, and a more detailed, those of you who want to pursue this topic, and that is in the playlist Russia under Yeltsin and Putin. So there you are, we begin. Thank you.
I have tremendous respect for your intellectual independence, diversity of thought, and fascination with our human project writ large.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. And for those who don't know you, Dr. Brovkin, you were born in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg in the former Soviet Union. You attended St. Petersburg University before immigrating to the US at 23. You studied Soviet history, and you did your graduate work at Princeton, Georgetown, and Berkeley. And then finally, you worked as an associate professor of Soviet history at Harvard for several years. You have taught in the US, in Russia, and in Morocco, and you're currently retired and living in France.
Correct. That's right.
And you've most recently published a very impressive book called From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity. I think your other books on Russian history include The Mensheviks After October, Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Dear Comrades, and Russia After Lenin.
Yes, correct.
Do I have them all? Okay, I will include links for that when we publish this interview, Dr. Brovkin. I hadn't heard of that last one, so I'll be sure to include that one as well.
Thank you.
So tell me, Dr. Brovkin, we have so much to talk about.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the story of your life. I know you were born in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. Tell me.
But eventually, a colleague again called me, and she offered me a job as an adjunct professor, which means you're not staff. You're a professor as long as there's a grant or fellowship to keep you there. So what you do in this case is you apply for grants, and then you get them, and then you are a professor as long as the project lasts. So it's much, much worse than being a tenured professor where you're guaranteed life, your position for life, but it's better than being unemployed.
Yes.
So that's what I did. It was, again, American University. I was back in Washington, D.C., and again, I loved it. It was very nice. Yeah, this was another good period, very good period. That was 99, 2000, 2001. And I plunged into this life in DC, and I was everywhere. It was Brookings and all the think tanks, and I would go and listen. And I was invited to give a lecture here, to talk there and everywhere, and all the conferences, including the ones in CIA. and FBI and everywhere. I was like, I really was totally, knew everybody who is in Russian studies in DC at that time. So it was great. Yeah.
So the two questions I want to follow up on.
Yeah.
The first one, you briefly mentioned a sense of frustration that your ideas had not landed or have not landed.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about that later, but that is definitely something I want to come back to.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, we're talking about 96, 97. So,
Yeah.
6 or 7 years, 5, 6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And you're living here in the United States. What was it like living here and reading about what was going on
Yeah.
back home?
Yeah, I'll
And
tell you,
how,
this is a great story
yeah,
because what I missed in telling you is that uh, in 1993, I had a sabbatical year.
mm,
Every 5 years, you have a sabbatical year. And especially if you're associate professor, they expect you to produce a next book. And so I took this year and I went to to Russia. It was open. I could do it now. There was no obstacles. So the school year 1993-94, I spent in Moscow working
wow,
in the archives. And again, that was fantastic. It was such an interesting time. When I arrived, it was the time of the Yeltsin coup, when he shot at the parliament. And I
yes,
was staying in a hotel. Well, actually, I had dinners in the hotel, which was called Mir, where you could see the burning parliament.
wow,
Again, I plunged right into the thick of history.
yes,
And it had absolutely incredible impression on me because I understood everything at close hand. I understood on the one hand, that Yeltsin and especially people around him were really genuinely pro-Western. They really meant that now we're one. We don't need to be different. We have to join the West and U.S. And this is why there are all these U.S. advisors. I knew many of them personally,
yeah,
uh, and at the, that's one level. But another level is that there were many, many crooks and thieves and criminals who were in Yeltsin's administration because they made money under the
sure,
corrupt Soviet system. And they were the ones who would be later known as oligarchs. I describe all that, by the way, in my
yeah,
chapter on the 90s. But the most important one is the misery of regular people. And this is the time when you have these huge lines of elderly women who would sell one piece of sausage, or he would just stand there with one piece of milk, and you would ask him, "Why are you selling this?" And she said, "Well, the people who go to the metro, they are in a hurry, and if I sell it to them with 10 cents more, they don't care. But for me, I could buy bread for this."
wow,
So there was misery, terrible time, crime. I mean, so many women were raped in the
yeah,
apartments that they would just be some guys hanging around there and they would lock the room or the elevator or whatever. This was really, really the worst. I actually said this is probably worse than Stalin, because at
wow,
Stalin, they would arrest the communists, but if you're not a communist, you're okay. If you go to your job in your factory, you're safe. If you don't involved in any Trotsky or anybody who had anything to do with politics, you're safe, like
mm,
my Brovkin family. But that time, nobody was safe.
yeah,
You could encounter a criminal at any time, and there were so many, pyramid schemes that people would invest their money and then they would lose everything. And then there were people with not very bright people would sign a paper, and it turned out to be that they signed that they sold their apartment, and then the big guys would come and throw somebody out of the apartment and they would be homeless, and they would say, "You signed this paper, didn't you?" And they had no idea what they were signing. There was so many of these stories like this, and when you hear it in the newspapers, that's one thing, but when you live through it
yeah,
right there in front of my very eyes, I really gained incredible understanding of Yeltsin's Russia and what it really meant for the Russian people. It's amazing. And that generated my interest, which later manifested in a big article I wrote, Corruption in Russia. and then many more articles about the money laundering and about one of my articles was making money, moving money, parking money overseas, about how Russian oligarchs were stealing money and sending it overseas. And here I want to mention one more thing, which among my successes. In 1999, uh, through this association with Louise Shelley in American University, I was one of the speakers at the U.S. Congress hearings on the Bank of New York scandal. And we testified in front of the banking committee on Russian oligarchs and theft of resources and moving this money to the West. And they had hearing, and we were the main speakers. And it is in the official records of the U.S. Congress. So I was considered a specialist, and indeed I knew it quite well from personal experience and from the professional work I did at that time. So the 1990s were very, very important for Russia and in my life as well, because I got to know. One other thing I can tell you more, much more about it. But one other high point was that in 1996, there were elections to the presidency in Russia, and Yeltsin ran, and I was an official observer. I was actually hired to be an observer.
Wow.
And and what we saw is how they stole these elections. They basically stopped counting at 3 in the morning, and then at 8 in the morning they announced that Yeltsin won, and no figures were provided. So it was really, and the West covered up. The Western governments covered up stolen elections. So much for wanting democracy in Russia. Uh,
Yeah.
that Yeltsin lost, and he decided not to go. Uh, well, he was forced to go 3 years later, but that's a separate story. Yeah.
So, Dr. Brovkin, what did the average Muscovite think during this time? When you were there, what were people's general perceptions on the street? I've only read about how terrible the early 90s were in Moscow.
It's,
I'm just
I
curious
think
what.
it's very hard to say because different people in different sort of sides of society had different opinions. But I think the most important thing is that they had no time to think. They had to fight for survival. Because if you don't earn, you die. And nobody cares. That's the thing. Let me give you an example. I was doing research in the archives, and this was at the Institute of Marxism-Leninism. So they had a great building, and in the Soviet times, they had all the privileges and, best service and building and all that. And the one time I ran into an elderly woman, and she introduced herself that she was a director. And I said I was a Russian who was an American and I was doing research. She said, "Well, step in my office, we'll chat." And so I talked to her, and she said that the roof was leaking, that the government didn't pay any salaries at all for already 2 years, that they don't know how to survive and how to keep the building, that there was like water was leaping and destroying the books. And
Yeah.
the only way she survived is that she rented some of the rooms to some Western companies who needed space in the center of Moscow. That was her only source of survival for her and for the people who work there. That's Russia of the 1990s.
That's
Yeah,
an
and
unbelievable.
some people would stay in kiosks. They would sell little bits of pieces of this and that in kiosks, like bread and cigarettes or this and that. And they would pay to these women, they would pay $1 a night. Like the entire night through, you stand in the kiosk. It's a winter, it's cold, and you sell stuff, and you get paid $1 a night. That was the time when some people earned $30 a month. That's it. $30 a month. This was enough to buy potatoes. Maybe that's it. Potatoes and bread, just not to die from starvation. That was the extent of misery.
And your family was still in St. Petersburg during this time?
Yes,
Your
my
parents
father,
and
my father died in 1978. And so my grandmother died much earlier. So the only people in my family who were still alive in the 90s was my aunt, who I love dearly, and I call her Coca, uh, which means a godmother. She's the
Mm,
one who baptized me,
mm.
and she was my father's sister. And so she lived in St. Petersburg, and I visited her lots of times, and she did me. So she was the only one still there. And there's a great story that I tell you that I always say when I think of her is that she was a famous doctor. She was a very famous. Her portrait is still in the Institute of Orthopedics
Oh,
in
wow.
St. Petersburg. And there were people from all over the Soviet Union coming to see her. Anyway, she was quite famous, and she had the highest possible salary in the Soviet Union, which was 500 rubles a month, which is big. It was like $500 a month. And average salary was about 100. So she was quite well off because she was such a famous doctor.
Yeah.
So she had her life savings, and her life savings were 5,000 rubles. So this is the example that I always give for people to understand what happened. In 1989, before any of this inflation and the collapse of the Soviet Union, for 5,000 rubles, you could buy a new car. That was the value. 5,000 rubles, you go buy a new car. Okay? In 1995, when no, I should, 93, 95, 94, I was in Russia. For 5,000 rubles, you could buy one chicken. So if you kept your money in the bank, it's the same rubles, they look the same. And if
Yeah.
you didn't invest it in something tangible, you basically ruined. You lost your life savings, and that's it. They're worth nothing. That's the kind of inflation that happened in the first 2 years of Yeltsin's rule, from a
Wow.
car to a chicken. And she was almost starving in a sense. There were a lot of happy parents who gave her food
Yeah.
because she saved a lot of children.
That's unbelievable. You just read about these nightmare stories about Russia in the early 90s, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to have been there.